Welcome to Team 4's expert presentation on a global context, created by Misty Stratton, Dawn Turner, Lindsay Wellington, and Jessica Yearing. In Hatton Clonk's chapter titled Postcolonialism, the authors assert that universality is a mistake when trying to understand a people or culture because of the issue of racial and ethnical differences. Postcolonial theory is a theory that seeks to demonstrate how the philosophical and political commitments of many historians will always ignore or misrepresent other cultures. Postcolonialism does this by asking what history would look like if it were written from the periphery point of view, and what stories would be told by history if the colonized voice narrated and evaluated. Postcolonialism is not a study of other cultures, nor is it a systematic approach. Instead, it explores the interaction between imperial and indigenous cultures by addressing how colonization changes the way people think, act, write, etc. It also looks at the political struggles throughout the world, the decolonization after World War II, and the fight for global racial and ethnic equality. Edward Said, a Palestinian-American professor, helped to establish postcolonial theory. In his book Orientalism, Said analyzes the inaccurate cultural representations by Western intellectuals. Orientalism is an academic specialization studied by those in the West who are concerned with Middle Eastern and North African cultures. It is seen as a way of dividing the world into West and East as a means of domination. The Imaginary Orient, an article by Linda Nochlin, applies this theory to art that she refers to as Orientalist paintings, saying that these works illustrate nothing about the cultures representing within. However, they do reflect the background beliefs and ideological needs of Europeans. A dyadic split, West-East, us-them mentality is emphasized by the depiction of a pure Orient without the depictions of intercultural contact. Major influences on postcolonialism included the Negritude movement, a concern for social determination of black consciousness, and the black skin white masks that explored the ways the black psyche was distorted and damaged by colonialism. Said's Orientalism marked the beginning of postcolonialism. Orientalism, according to Edward Said, is a style of thought based upon ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident, the Orient being a product of discourse created by Western institutions and ideas. Next, Hatton Clonk introduces to hybridity, the historical method that pinpoints the politics of cultural exchange, and they give us two examples. First, an article by David Craven suggests abstract expressionism was influenced by Western, Navajo, and Mexican work. Second, in an essay by Annie Combs, she asserts the need to think more broadly about the cultural, social, and political structures in which art is displayed and consumed. In other words, exhibitions show objects that are a result of cultural contact and interaction. Craven believed Pollock's drip paintings were modeled on Navajo sand paintings. Pollock immersed himself in Navajo art during a time when Native American traditional forms were being discouraged. Craven sees Pollock's use of Navajo culture as a challenge to this racism. Walker anchors much of her work in documents reflecting life before and after the Civil War. Darkytown Rebellion is also born from a desire to translate the past into visual form. Walker discovered a landscape painting in a book titled American Primitive Painting, which featured artwork by unschooled artists. One anonymous landscape, mysteriously titled Darkytown, intrigued Walker and inspired her to remove the oversized African American caricatures. She placed them, along with more figures such as jockeys, rebels, and others, within a scene of rebellion, hence the reworked title of her 2001 installation. Through Darkytown Rebellion, Walker is not attempting to correct a late 19th century depiction of African Americans, but rather to broach a discussion that asks, are these merely images from the past, or do these caricatures still resonate in the 21st century? As Afghan Hazara have been a persecuted minority in Afghanistan for many years, it will be important to provide that history to the Western audience, highlighting the difference between Hazara people and the other peoples of Afghanistan. With that, we will need to work closely with the artist to ensure the depiction of his story and work, and that it is understood from a historical and lyrical point of view. The artist has stated that he does not want people to look at his paintings in the religious context because the political implications of his work are universal. Qadim Ali's paintings draw upon images and themes from the Persian epic poem Shahnameh, or Book of Kings, that was composed in the late 10th century. There are two main characteristics that are his focus. Rustam, who in the book symbolizes the good in humanity, a mighty warrior who was ultimately betrayed by his friends and killed, and the demons who represent the dark side of humanity. His series of paintings focus on the 2001 destruction of two 6th century Buddhas by the Taliban, carved by the Hazara in Bamiyan, Afghanistan. In the present day, Rustam has been appropriated by the Taliban to justify hostility and bloodshed, and they compare themselves to this great warrior. They declared themselves the winged Rustam, omnipresent with eyes everywhere. The contradiction in all of this is that the Taliban fighters, historically hostile to Persian culture, identify themselves as Rustam, holy warriors. Haunted Lotus refers to a poem written by Asad Buddha and plays with the notion of a third Buddha buried in the soil of the Bamiyan. This painting is an exploration of good and evil. The Taliban are represented as bloated demons attempting to limit, bind, smother, or drown Buddha or the Hazara people. This story is a universal one, because violence, aggression, and oppression are not limited to this particular community. It happens all over the world. Other universal themes, such as loss, displacement, victory, hope, and despair, are all present in Ali's paintings. Postcolonial theory, while asserting the need to speak from the margins, is still reliant on the colonizer's culture, relying as well on other theoretical methods like Marxism, psychoanalysis, Foucauldian discourse. The wish to provide a global theory requires a reductive approach. Historically, colonialism is used in a vague manner, but its forms are myriad. An example is the political cultural differences between Columbus's arrival in the Americas, the formation of the Mughal Empire in India in 6th century, and more recently, the Chinese invasion of Tibet. Politically, colonialism cannot be characterized as always bad, since it has also been enabling or progressive for some peoples. Colonization is not homogeneous. There are internal debates and struggles about the ethics and practice of imperialism. Conceptually, colonialism is often synonymous with racism, but this is not always the case, because sometimes it may be found on religious beliefs instead. Next, author Eric Fernie tells us that art historians and theorists consider art history from a global view, describing differences in contemporary art and present art practices. Fernie also tells us that the present state of art history is seemingly broken up by two factions: the aesthetes and iconographers, who look back to antiquity for information, and the revolutionaries who seek to refute the validity of temple art, mammon, and patriarchy. We see a shift in the writing and study of art history. It has moved from the 16th and 17th century in Italy, the 18th century in Germany, the 19th century in German-speaking countries, and then to English-speaking countries in the 20th century. Artworks also changed throughout the ages, from Vasari's uniqueness, Winckelmann's expression of high culture, and Hegel's manifestation of spirit and social focus. By the mid-20th century, the focus was on content. Olu Oguibe, a University of Illinois professor of art history, wrote an essay titled "In the Heart of Darkness." This was an in-depth study of the westernization of Africa and the European influence in Africa. Oguibe makes three distinct points in his essay. Number one, all societies view themselves as a center and another society of contrast. Therefore, instead of accepting one singular center of history, it is best to review multiple versions of history. He describes the West as the single center of historical discourse. He challenges this practice and desires for replacement of the single center, calling for a multi-centered history and modernism. In other words, modernism in history would represent a global context not only existing in the European Western context. Number two, the author wishes to undermine the concept of a transition from primitivism to modernism in Africa. Oguibe confronts the notion of Africanity and the construct of African culture in general. He addresses the European tendency to primitize sub-Saharan Africa. He also questions whether there is a singular African identity. And lastly, number three, the author makes a powerful contrast between the positive assessment of African influence on 20th century European art and the negative response to Western sources of modern forms in Africa. Although the usage of primitive art is encouraged in European culture, the implementation of European motifs in African culture is seen as a form of rejecting African identity. Probably one of the most famous examples of a European artist implementing African art into his work would be Picasso. In this detail of Demoiselle d'Avignon, there's a distinct connection between the face of the female on the left and the Congolese mask on the right. Here we see a South African artist named Charles Nkosi and his liner cut titled Pain on the Cross, number 1. This obviously shows a very strong Christian influence. German professor Hans Belting's essay, The End of the History of Art, characterizes the shortcomings of the old art history and the possibility of the new one. Change in art history can be traced to modernism. There are two different histories of art, pre-modern history and modern history. However, the inclusion of both older and modern art present problems in placing contemporary art within the broader context of art history. Belting calls for a re-examination of modernism. It is this boundaryless art historical context that makes connoisseurship inapplicable. Belting states that art no longer presents a single face, and that today's artists are rethinking their own tasks, expanding the possibilities of media such as painting and sculpture in order to further the discourse of the image. Today's artists, like historians, are rethinking the function of art as well, and challenging art's traditional claim to aesthetic autonomy. Next we have Preziosi's globalization and its discontents. It is in this chapter that we see a synopsis of Timothy Mitchell's discourse of the following chapter, together with his influences, actual and potential, and Preziosi's own thoughts on the topic at hand. The chapter introduces a group of Arab students, ambassadors, visit to France, how they interpreted the culture there and were likewise interpreted by it. The term Orientalism is introduced here as well, and so is globalism. Preziosi asks the question of whether a globalized art historical perspective is truly possible. He also mentions that from the beginning of the scholarship, this institutionalized perspective was its intention, its goal. In highlighting globalism, Preziosi sets the reader up for a clever, authentic discernment of whether it would indeed be realistic to globalize art history. In Timothy Mitchell's Orientalism and the Exhibitionary Order, this article covers the World's Fair mentality of late 19th century and early to mid 20th century Europe and European perspectives on the outside world, most notably the Arab culture in Europe. Though Paris' medieval Cairo exhibit was presented as a setting akin to what may have been the original scene at the time, the exhibit was still in Paris, and not of or in its presented era. Reality consciousness is asked of the reader. The Egyptian visitors themselves became a part of the exhibit then, whether they wanted or expected to be at all. This was a result of the formulaic and gradually implemented mindset of the host culture, which calls into question even today our very programming of vision and sense of the idealist epicentral authority over not only the rest of the world, but over how that world is recorded and presented in historical record. Mitchell begins by discussing several Egyptian delegates' experiences in Paris under the headlining theme of Orientalism, a freely applied, though hardly concrete term, born, at least in its modern usage, of imperialist Britain. It refers to the East in its most base definition, but came to mean all peoples not of the West, upon whom the yoke of the West was called to confine, refine, and evaluate through a seemingly subliminal subordination. Mitchell ends his article then with record of how one Gustave Flaubert interpreted Egypt in temporal parallel and journalistic contrast to the four Egyptians in Europe. The reader therefore is given an understanding of both cultures from the experience of the other, and left to infer for themselves whatever truth is there to be known. However, Mitchell himself did not take a fierce side or a stand in his own argument. Whether he would have been right or wrong in doing so, he would have left an account of his own thoughts, and the thoughts, collectively speaking, of a scholarly chapter in the continuum of art historical theory. This concludes Team 4's expert presentation on a global context. The following frames are informative: terms, people, questions, and finally, references. From Dawn, Lindsay, Jessica, and myself, thank you for listening.